welcome everyone. My name is Gluskin. I am front-end developer in Visuality, and today I want to talk about data synchronization on frontend. So let's start. For the past year, I've been involved in quite interesting project, and just to give you the sense of idea what it is about, there are recruiters who are using this app, and in the database we have lawyers, which will be referred as candidates from now on, and we also have employers. And the goal is to match ones with others using various tools available in the app. Right now, I would like to draw your attention to two parts of this page. So there is a table where recruiters can browse and search for the candidates, and there is candidate preview, where we show more detailed information about those. And let's just try to break down the candidate preview into smaller pieces. So the first one, which we can distinguish, is just main information. You can see in the header there is a name, there is employer, assigned recruiter, grade, and some boring information in the middle. And I want you to think about all of that information as just one single context, as data for that is coming from single API endpoint. Here we also have like notes, there are also submissions, files, communications which are associated with this candidate, and each of those represents a different context, as data for those is fetched from different API endpoints. And table is a separated context as well. So with that idea in mind, I would like to introduce you the tool which we use to manage those contexts in the app. So it's called Redux. This is a tool which we use for managing the global store. So whenever you have some data that must be accessible from multiple places in your app, you just put it into the Redux store, and then your components with some proper configuration can have an access to this. One of the most important thing in the Redux terminology is the idea of reducer. Reducer is just a function that is responsible for changing this global store. So you, by default, when you set up a Redux, you have just single object which represents a global store, and you have single reducer which is responsible for changing this. And this is fine for small apps, but whenever your app grows bigger and you have more components, more pages, it's not really convenient. So instead of single object which represents entire store, you would rather divide it into the substores or subcontexts. In that case, for each such substore, you would have a different reducer. And so this way, I just want to show you the correlation between Redux reducer, which has introduced, so responsible for changing, and the context. So think about those as one single thing. And now I would like to show you an example of how do we use Redux on the basic level. So here we have this candidate preview, and the first thing which we want to do, we want to connect this candidate preview with the candidate context. So whatever data is kept there is available to this component. And right now, imagine we would like to change some of the candidate data. For example, we would like to remove information about assigned recruiter. So whenever we click on the trash icon in the step number 2, we dispatch a special Redux action, for example, with the name unassigned recruiter. The next thing is that our reducer is able to recognize this action with our configuration. So it will take the name of the action and it will properly handle it, entire information about assigned recruiter from the candidate. The fourth step is rather internal one, so it happens inside the Redux. It just emits a change event that the data in the context has changed. And because our component is connected to this candidate context, when our reducer changes candidate context, the change is instantly propagated to this component, and as a result, we would have something like that. Are there any questions about that? Cool, so now you know Redux. Congrats. Pretty easy, right? All right, so what is the problem? What I've just described is relatively simple example. So you just have one context, you want to make a small change, you dispatch an action, it's updated. But what if the change in one context should cause change in another one? So whenever we want to unassign the recruiter from the candidate, we want that name disappear not only from the preview, but from this table as well, because this is the same candidate. And the same goes for the grade. You change the grade there, it should be updated here. So just to give you an idea how it should work, I've prepared a small video. So we try to unassign the recruiter there, and it changes here. The same there. You change the grade, it changes here. So this is how we expect it to work. And what are our options to implement such logic? Probably the easiest solution would be to reload entire context, which might be updated. So you change the assigned recruiter, reload the table context. You change the grade, reload the table context. You change nodes or communications or whatever, and it might influence on the candidate context, reload candidate context. This solution is quite easy. It's very reliable because you have always up-to-date data. But, well, first of all, it's not very user-friendly. Moreover, it forces us to make extra API calls to refetch the data, because that's what I mean by reloading. And, well, for me, it just seems redundant. So why would you refetch the data? So basically, you are asking for the changes which you already know, because you are the one who made those changes. It's just, well, for me, those API requests are redundant, and my goal was to avoid those. And I was thinking that with all great tools that are available in the current web development, we can just simply do it better. So that was my goal. Let me right now focus on the concrete example, so it will be easier for you to grasp the idea and explain my approach. Okay, here we have this familiar candidate preview, and we already know that it's connected to the candidate context. Now you can also see there is a files context here. And the thing is that we do not show files and we do not load information about files until we actually click on the Files tab. And when you open Preview for the first time, Info tab is shown first. But at the same moment, we always want to show the number of files that is associated with this candidate. And for that, we keep that number in the candidate context, because in that case, it's always available. And now the tricky part is that whenever you create a file or delete a file, not only the files context should be updated correspondingly, but that number as well. So the change in the files context should cause change in the candidate context. So this is our case. And now it's time to introduce another tool which we're using. It's called Redux Saga. Saga is just a tool which you use to have some more complicated logic as a side effect when you dispatch some Redux actions. So what I've explained about reducer, when you want to make some change, you just dispatch a simple Redux action, and reducer is responsible for changing it. But, well, this is fine for small cases, because reducer is usually something very not complicated. And whenever you have some more sophisticated logic, then you would rather have you would rather use Saga to specify what kind of complicated logic it should be. Again, will be much simpler by an example. So this candidate preview, as we know, it's connected to the candidate context, but when you open the preview for the first time, there is no information about the candidate. So candidate context is empty. So we must fetch information in the beginning. So the first step which we want to do, we want to configure Saga to run some custom worker, which is basically a function, to fetch information about candidate. So this Saga worker should react on the Redux action, which should be fetch candidate information. So this is step number one. In the step number two, when this component, when we open the candidate preview, we dispatch a Redux action to fetch candidate information. When we do this, our Saga worker gets called because it listens to this action. And then our worker, it does two things. In the step number three, so the first thing it does, it makes an API call to fetch candidate data. And when it's successful, it takes this response from the API call and sends it together with the Redux action to actually update the candidate context. And our reducer is ready to handle this Redux action, so it just takes this payload, updates the candidate context, and because this component is connected to it, so it instantly knows about the data. So this is how it works. Maybe any questions about Redux Saga? Okay, cool. well, this is pretty easy case, but well, it's also one of the most used ones. And in general, we have more cases like this in the application, and some of them are more complicated. And you will see actually more later in this presentation. All right, so what about my configuration? What I've told about Redux Saga is kind of simple side effect, right? So you dispatch a Redux section, it reacts to this, make API call, and update the context. And it's usually all handled in one file. So for one file, you have for one context, you have single Saga file. For my approach, I had to transform it from the file into the folder with subfolders. And each subfolder represents a context which should update itself whenever change somewhere else happens. For example, we have a contact subfolder. Inside, there are configurations which tell how context should be updated when change in some other context should happen. And the same for the rest of the folders. And how does this configuration look like? Here is a sample object of it. So reducer name. It's just the name of the context which we want to listen to for changes. In this case, we want to listen for files context changes. Don't be confused by the name user and document. This is just how we call candidate and file on the application level. So as I said, we're listening for the changes in the files context. API methods, just a list of methods which we want to filter by when action is happening. And Saga action is basically just a function, or the Saga worker, which should get called when two criteria are met. I hope you remember that part which I explained regarding fetching the candidate data. So we have almost identical one, but for sending data. It's practically the same flow, just a bit different implementation. But we start with completely the same thing. We want to listen when we dispatch Redux action to send some data in the files context. So we configure Saga to that. We dispatch this Redux action. Our Saga worker gets called, and it also makes API request. Just in the first case, it was fetch. In that case, it can be either delete, create, or update. And when this action is succeeded, we dispatch a success Redux action to update the files context. So I think it's more or less clear, especially because it's the same as in the previous example. Okay, and now we actually wait for the moment when we have to update candidate context after the change in files context has happened. Here is this configuration from the previous slide. So we are just waiting until some Redux action is dispatched for sending data. And we start with a completely identical thing. You can see that the lines are almost the same. So when we dispatch this Redux action, for example, we click on the button for deleting the file, we dispatch an action, both workers get called simultaneously. And we already know what the first one does. It's here. So we make API call and then dispatching success action. And let's look at what the second one does. First, it just filters by API methods whether it is supported here. If it's not, we just drop it. But if it is supported, here is a quite interesting thing. We are starting arrays. Why? Here, when the API method is executed, after it finished, one of two things will happen. Either it will fail or it will succeed. If it succeeds, it will dispatch a success Redux action. But if it fails, it will dispatch, well, it's not here, but in reality it is there, it will dispatch an error action. So here in this race, we're just waiting which one gets called. Because if we wait just for the success, then in case error occurred, it will be yielding forever, and it will create a memory leak. The same goes if you listen just for the error. So we're starting a race, and if the error message got called first, then we drop it, because no need to update candidate context after something has failed. But if it didn't, we actually execute our Saga worker to update the candidate context. And how does this happen? This file is usually, it can be as simple and as complicated as you want it to be. In that case, it's relatively simple. So what do we need to update the candidate context? First, of course, we must get first access to this. There can be a situation when you create or delete a file on the page where there is no candidate information displayed. So no candidate context, nothing to update. But if there is, in this piece of code, I'm just taking the condition that file is truly associated with this candidate context, because in our application, each file has a relationship to the candidate. So I'm just checking if this file, whether it is deleted or created, is really associated with this candidate, because the last thing which we want to do, the last thing which we want to do is to update the wrong context or update it with the wrong information. And if both those save clauses are passed, then we are able to dispatch our Redux action to actually update the candidate context. And implementation of it is not so important, so just take it for granted that it works. And this is basically it. So what are the advantages of this approach? First of all is the folder structure. I think when you look at this for the first time, the only thing which you have to know about that is that every subfolder corresponds to a context which must update itself when change somewhere else happens. If you know that, I think it's pretty easy to navigate there. So it's quite easy to read, maintain, and obviously to extend, because everyone can create files and folders. But we've developed this solution like 4 or 5 months ago, and since then we've added quite a few places where we had to have similar logic, so there was no problem in adding new ones. Another thing which, in my opinion, is important is that isolation of this function, so of the function which updates actually that context. Why it is important that it's isolated? Because here we're, as I said, this is relatively simple. We're just getting access to 2 contexts. So the candidate context, and here there is also table context. If you were to do that inside the component, that would be much harder to achieve, because you would have to configure your component to manually configure your component to have access to those contexts. And this would make component you just pollute the component. It would make it unreadable, and it also sucks. So this way, because it's kind of isolated into some, let's say, special space, so because it's a side effect, so there is no point into connecting it to the component, and this way you are able to, well, to make it as complex as you want it to be, because in the real app we do have some places where the logic is more sophisticated than this, and it's very convenient to use some Saga tools to get access to any context that we want, and just to be as secure as possible when it comes to these things. And I think this is practically it. So probably the last thing which I want to mention is that, well, I realize that there are some disadvantages of this approach. Like probably the obvious one is that there is no single source of truth, but we were ready to sacrifice that in order to have a better user experience. And plus, we do not apply this to some big changes, only whenever some, let's say, tiny information is changing, so we can be sure that it's safe to update it manually. And I realize that it might not fit to every situation. So, but I just hope that maybe this approach will inspire for some alternative solution. And well, I would definitely love to know what are the alternatives when you need to resolve a problem like that. So I think this is it. Thank you.